All right, guys. Apologies for the delay, but I'd like to welcome you all to the first event of World AIDS Awareness Week, which is Dr. Over speaking on the public policy side of the AIDS epidemic. I would like to also note that our co-sponsors in this event are the World Affairs and the Committee on Lectures, both funded by the government of the student body. I'd also like to extend a personal thanks for Pat Miller and the Lectures Department, along with Molly and Joyce, for their work and support throughout this process. I'd like to let you guys know about the other events we have going on throughout the week. The first event being tonight, and then the next event being tomorrow, a documentary film known as Blood Brother, which is a harrowing tale of a Philadelphian who becomes disillusioned, moves to southern India, and really makes a meaningful connection there and continues to serve at an HIV/AIDS orphanage, caring for children. And the documentary kind of basically pictures most of his life and then describes what a personal impact AIDS has made in southern India. A next event we will have on Thursday, which will be at 7 p.m. in the Cardinal Room. It's about global AIDS and malnutrition and how you can equip yourself with the tools necessary to truly make a difference. And now for the welcome of our speaker, Dr. Over. So it's my special honor to introduce him. I had the privilege of having dinner with him. He is worked with the World Bank and the Center for Global Development, mostly with HIV/AIDS policy. A fun fact is he was one of the first people in Peace Corps that they sent off, specifically to Burkina Faso. He co-authored the World Bank's first report on AIDS, known as Confronting AIDS, Public Priorities for a Global Epidemic. Now he works for the Center for Global Development, and he's published his most recent book, which is called Achieving an AIDS Transition, Preventing Infections to Sustain Treatment. In addition to his numerous research projects at the center, he serves as a member of the Steering Committee of HIV/AIDS Modeling Consortium, funded by Bill and Melinda Gates. Now, if you'd like to join me, let's welcome Meet Over.
So thank you very much, Deepak, and thanks for dinner. That was a great dinner, and I enjoyed meeting your friends. What is the name of the organization that your associates are?
ISU Global Health and AIDS Coalition.
That's it. Great. How many of you here are in that same group? Are you all dues-paying members? I'm sure Deepak can hopefully get some more recruits if he keeps running interesting programs like this. Thanks very much for inviting me way out here in the Midwest. I did do my PhD training at the University of Wisconsin in Madison and very much enjoyed the far too many years that I spent there. So that's my contact with the Midwest, really. And this is my first trip to a state that has so many vowels in its name. And thanks for having me. And it's great that you guys are doing a whole week of AIDS awareness. Is that right? So hopefully you'll have many activities, and hopefully some of the people who come to speak will be speaking from a medical perspective or a public health perspective. I hope that you have people who are true experts in either medicine or public health or the biology of AIDS, which is fascinating. It's a diabolical virus. I myself come from an economics background, and I will be presenting a perspective that is different from those that you'll hear from others. So I hope that you will be able to take what I'm saying and weave it together with the other things that you're learning about AIDS as you come to understand this terrible epidemic, which is, I think, finally beginning to show, finally beginning to succumb in some very important ways to the efforts that we've been spending now for decades to combat it. So what do I have to do to turn on the projector? Oh, that's my computer that has to do that, right?
Do you have the...
Well, probably first of all I need to switch it. I don't know if the tech guy did this.
There you go. Sorry.
There we go. Okay, great. So to introduce myself a little bit more, how many of you have heard of the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C.? Yeah, so not so many. And you are interested in global health and in AIDS in particular. So you might be interested in our website, and I wanted to bring that to your attention. The Center for Global Health, the Center for Global Development, was created in 2001 by a philanthropist whose name is Ed Scott, and it has the specific purpose of trying to improve foreign assistance by the United States, by other bilaterals, and by the multilaterals like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And in order to fulfill that role, we have to stand a bit apart from those agencies. We do not receive funding from the United States government, and we do not receive funding from the World Bank. We do receive funding from lots of other of the players, the bilateral donors like the British bilaterals and the European bilaterals like Australia. But there's a small portion of our money that comes from each of those sources. We also have a little bit of money from, a small proportion of our money that comes from the private sector, companies like Chevron and Johnson & Johnson that are interested in global engagement. So the fact that we don't receive money from U.S. government, I think, gives us more objectivity. And I hope that you will notice some signs of that in my talk tonight. I want to make you aware of the fact that we're not specifically a health group, but among the about 15 senior people, there are about 4 of us who work on health. So it's the largest single concentration of expertise at the Center for Global Development. And we're really talking to donors more than we are trying to advise the policymakers in the developing countries themselves. But we're doing that with hopes of improving the efficacy of foreign assistance. And I want to in particular draw your attention to our blogs, and particularly the Global Health Policy blog, which today has this blog by Jenny, which is basically a wrap-up of some of the recent work that we've been doing on the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And some of that includes references to PEPFAR activities. You'll see a blog by me based on an impact evaluation workshop I ran for PEPFAR in Harare, Zimbabwe last week. And you'll see blogs by Amanda Glassman, the Director of Health at the Center for Global Development, about how to improve the efficacy of the Global Fund, and also celebrating the fact that the Global Fund looks like it's headed towards a very full replenishment of its funds. So this particular blog is a good one to check out, to get a sort of a guide to everything we've been doing recently on AIDS. So with that background, I want to launch into the talk for this evening. And I understand that there's a large variation. Let me get out of Skype here in case I get a phone call from Harare. Oh, that doesn't work. Does that say Iowa? Yes, it does. So tonight I want to talk to you about the global struggle against AIDS. I want to talk specifically about the U.S. role in that struggle. I want to talk again about how I think that the donors separately, collectively, and especially PEPFAR could somewhat alter their policy stance towards the countries that they're assisting in order to improve the effectiveness of the engagement of the international community in battling the AIDS epidemic. So the place to start probably is not with this slide, but with the total number of people who are currently infected with AIDS. Now, this is a number that we talk about every World AIDS Day, every December. How many of you actually have an idea? Is the number of people in the world infected with AIDS 3 million? 35 million or 350 million? Right in the middle. You guys have been doing too many multiple choice tests, right? So, in fact, that's right. The AIDS epidemic has grown from almost no cases at all, only a few scattered cases that were undiscovered in 1980, to now reach the total of 35 million. And that total seems to be leveling off, although there's some sign that it may be continuing to grow, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So in response to this epidemic, this slide that I'm showing you now shows the most extraordinary increase in financing for any aspect of foreign assistance that the world has ever seen. In 1987, when I began to work on the economics of the AIDS epidemic, you can see that there was very little money going into battling the epidemic. And really, the first really inflection point in this curve occurred when President Bush pushed Congress into authorizing the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief in 2003. And from that point on, you can see the PEPFAR here. There had been a beginning before that, but the PEPFAR program really pushed this thing into overdrive until by the year 2008, we went up to $13 billion internationally being spent each year on AIDS. The more recent picture, this graph shows between 2002 and 2012. You can see up until 2008, you still had that pretty much geometric increase in spending, which is extremely different from all other aspects of foreign assistance and quite different than funding for health in general. But then when the fiscal crisis hit in 2008, you see a stuttering in that financial response, a leveling off. The numbers that you see are the number of billions of dollars being spent annually on the epidemic, till there was a dip which reached its low point in 2010. More recently, we're seeing a recovery, and the announcement that President Obama made yesterday shows signs that the U.S. Contribution to that recovery is going to be sustained in 2013 and beyond. Also, the fact that the U.S. government has just reauthorized, just a couple of weeks ago, has reauthorized PEPFAR for another 5 years is an important statement of the continuing political push by the United States to combat this epidemic. And one of the most striking things about that reauthorization bill is it's one of the very few bipartisan successes, one of the very few places where we've seen the Republicans and the Democrats collaborate. Even the committee meetings that were held in preparation for that bill, and a meeting that I had with staff from those committees, they were all bipartisan. Whereas for most of the other things that are going on in Congress today, as you know, there's extraordinarily divisiveness, and the Republicans and Democrats would meet with experts separately, and they would convene separately to establish their positions before they come together and fail to agree on anything at all. But really, AIDS has been a standout example of bipartisan collaboration. And let's hope that that goes forward, because I think the gains that we've made against the AIDS epidemic need desperately to be sustained, and unless we have that continued financial engagement of the international community, we're not likely to see these gains sustained. We might see substantial erosion in those gains. Now, how does that total amount of money, that $8 to $9 billion in international spending, look? And what is the share of the different contributors? This slide about 2012 funding shows that really the biggest part of the whole program, the biggest part of the financing comes from the U.S. government. PEPFAR stands for President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. The next largest contributor after PEPFAR is the European governments as a unity. So if you think of Europe as if it were a single country, its contribution is about 16%. Sorry, that isn't the next largest, but the next largest is really the Global Fund. The Global Fund is not a bilateral program, though, and it's funded it's funded by the U.S. government with support from the U.S. Congress. President Obama just announced yesterday that he's going to provide $5 billion over the next 3 years, and he can say that with some confidence because of the bipartisan support that AIDS has received in Congress. So you can see that the U.S. role is very important here, not only in its direct contribution through PEPFAR programs, but also through its indirect contribution via the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria in Geneva. This shows an approximate. It's pretty hard to get an exact breakdown of U.S. government spending between treatment and prevention, but this shows an approximate. The red line shows an approximation of the amount that the U.S. government is spending on the treatment portion of PEPFAR, with the blue representing the total amount. So the difference between the red and the blue consists of HIV prevention programs, which are not treatment, and also programs to help orphans and vulnerable children. So you can see that the funding, that green line is the U.S. funding for the Global Fund, and you can see that that's small in proportion to the whole. But in fact, it's a growing proportion of U.S. total commitment to fight the AIDS epidemic. And I believe that's a very good thing about U.S. policy and shows the wisdom of Ambassador Goosby and the people who are making policy decisions about U.S. Contributions to the fight against AIDS, the fact that they're moving an increasing proportion of the resources to flow through this multilateral. So I like this slide because on the left-hand side we can see that the U.S. government in general actually spends very little on foreign assistance. You can see that as a proportion of the gross national income of the United States, the amount that we spend on foreign assistance ranks way, way down. How many countries down is that? About 12? I can't count that quickly. But there's a real contrast between our general ranking, and then if we look at that portion of the total amount that we spend on foreign assistance, that's for the battle against the AIDS epidemic. In that particular dimension, we score far and away ahead of all other countries and ahead of Europe combined, as a matter of fact. So the role that we play in the AIDS epidemic is an important determinant of the U.S. foreign aid posture altogether. It's become a dominant theme of our foreign aid. And therefore, that's a reason, if you care about making foreign aid work for the United States and for the recipient countries, making it better, you have to care about AIDS, because that's what most of our foreign aid now consists of that's not military. So now I want to turn to the theme of the talk, which is something that I call the AIDS transition. And the word transition is used in many different ways around the AIDS epidemic. And if you read the blogs on AIDS, you read the scuttlebutt, you'll have heard it used in many senses. In fact, for example, now that Ambassador Goosby is retiring as the head of the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator and as our ambassador for AIDS, there's a talk about the transition in leadership. So the word transition can be used to mean change in many aspects. But I have a very particular reference that I want you all to think about. And in order to make you think about this, I have to take you back in time to the time in the 1970s and 1980s when people were really worried, like people like President Robert McNamara of the World Bank were really worried about what was being called the population explosion. So the population explosion was actually predicted to spell the end of the world as we knew it. There was a book written by a guy named Ehrlich called The Population Bomb. Have any of you ever heard of the population bomb? Peter's old enough to have heard of it. I don't know whether they actually teach you this in your development or global studies courses today because we don't actually worry about it too much. And the reason we don't worry about it too much is that many countries went through what was called, and what is still called, the demographic transition. So what is the demographic transition? This picture shows what, this comes from Wikipedia, I believe. It shows, or maybe it doesn't, you can see the source at the bottom, but you can find something like this on Wikipedia. So the vertical axis measures rates on the left-hand side. Those two blue and red curves are rates. So a birth rate is the number of persons born per unit of the population, and a death rate is the number of persons dying per unit of the population. And so usually it's per 100,000. Here, I guess it's per 1,000, right? So what you can see is that in pre-industrial periods, both the birth rate and the death rate were very high. And that's the time that that might have been described as a very miserable time because death rates were so high. Birth rates were also high. But because both rates were equally high, the population did not grow. So the black line represents the level of the population, the total number of people. And you can see as long as those lines stayed roughly similar, the total population didn't grow. But then what happened? Then, with civilization in Europe, we began to see a fall in the death rates. Public health interventions, in particular, water and sanitation, meant that death rates began to fall, but birth rates didn't fall at first. And with death rates lower than birth rates, the difference between the birth and the death rate means that population itself began to grow. The rate of growth of the population is just the difference between those two numbers, right? So that's why the black line starts to bend up. And the black line starts to bend up, and that's what was worrying people in the 1970s, because they were looking at the developing world where you saw this happening. Birth rates stayed high, but death rates had fallen dramatically. And by the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, they fell in the developing world because, of course, of antibiotics, as well as the public health interventions that had brought death rates down in Europe. So you had this population that was literally exploding. And the reason that the World Bank actually began to do health programs at all in the 1980s was because President McNamara was worried about population growth in the developing world. He was worried that it was bad for those countries themselves because they wouldn't be able to educate their populations. But he was also worried that it was bad more generally for the world at large if the number of people would double or triple in the near future. So as a result, the World Bank became involved in health investments as a way to get into these countries and talk to them about family planning. And the World Bank continues, as you know, to be very active in the health sector even today. But what actually happened? Well, what you see here is what happened in Europe, is that eventually birth rates fell. And in the developing world, in many countries, birth rates have also fallen. And when the birth rates fall enough so that birth rates and death rates are both low, what happens to the black line? Well, it levels off. In the case of countries where the birth rate falls even lower than the death rate, as has happened in France, for example, you'll actually see a decline in that black line, and the total population begins to fall. So the demographic transition describes a process in changing from a situation where both birth and death rates are high, population stable, to a situation where both birth and death rates are low, and the population is again stable. So that's the image I would like for you to keep in mind as we now talk about the AIDS epidemic. So what's been happening to mortality from AIDS? Well, as you know, since 2003, there has been a tremendous increase in AIDS treatment, thanks to the Global Fund, to the World Bank's early interventions, but also primarily to PEPFAR, President Bush's program, which has tremendously expanded treatment. It's had this very beneficial effect on mortality. So you can see that mortality, the two graphs are, this is a UNAIDS image, and it shows what mortality would have been, which is the top line in each of the four panels, and what it has been estimated to be actually, which is the lower line. And that divergence has been caused by the effective introduction and the rollout of AIDS treatment, which has now reached, for example, 2.4 million people in South Africa alone, close to 8 million in the developing world. So it's important to see how significant these mortality falls are. The other thing that you can see from this graph is, if you notice the vertical axis, notice how much larger the scale is here. So this also tells you the total number of deaths in the African continent. And notice that they are 10 times as large as in all of Asia. And they completely dwarf the number of deaths in the other regions of the developing world. So that's what's been happening to mortality. Does it sound familiar? It's a little bit like what happened to overall population mortality at the beginning of the demographic transition. But what's been happening to the births of new infections? Well, we call that HIV incidence. The annual number of new infections has unfortunately not been declining. This shows the annual number of new infections as it's estimated to have trended in each of the 4 regions. And what you see is an increase and then a decrease and a leveling off in Asia and Eastern Europe. In Latin America, you don't even see a decrease. In sub-Saharan Africa, you see a gradual downward trend of about 1 to 2% per year, which some epidemiologists believe is actually the result of the epidemic having saturated the population. Again, notice the vertical axes here. Notice how many more new infections there are in Africa than there are in the other continents. Oops. So let's zoom in on this new infection data. And we can put together the latest UNAIDS data on the world in this graph. The red line being mortality. Notice that the inflection or the peak that it reached in 2004, and then after PEPFAR came in, it really began to decline. The rate of new infections, however, did not show any inflection with the advent of PEPFAR, nor anywhere that you can see worldwide. And as a result, that white line shows a similar pattern as the black line in the demographic transition. It shows that after declining, or at least decelerating up until 2006, with the improved effectiveness and the improved availability of really good AIDS treatment, but unfortunately a real failure in the domain of HIV prevention, we see a widening of that gap between those two rates, and as a result, an acceleration in the increase of the number of people living with HIV/AIDS. If you zoom in on Africa, you see the same picture. Mortality here, unfortunately, the data that has been provided by UNAIDS is not as granular, but you can see the deaths having declined more than the new infections have declined, and the result is the annual addition to the number of HIV-positive people, the number of people living with HIV/AIDS on the African continent has continued to grow. Now, of course, part of this is very good news. It's very good news because it means that people who otherwise would have died of AIDS are surviving, and they're contributing their presence to the African economy, and especially to their societies and to their immediate family units. And all of that is extraordinarily valuable to those individuals. So there's been a health improvement thanks to the advent of treatment that is very dramatic. But what we also see is that in another sense, the problem's getting worse because the total number of people living with HIV/AIDS is continuing to grow. So if we want to accomplish an AIDS transition that would be comparable to the demographic transition and that would really mean defeating this epidemic, what do we have to do? Well, we have to hold AIDS mortality down, first of all. No one would have considered it a success if the demographic transition had equalized birth and death rates by returning to the Middle Ages with a very high mortality rate. That would not have been a demographic transition. So the AIDS transition has as a necessary component that we have to sustain our effort on AIDS treatment. And if possible, even improve on what we're currently doing. But if we're really going to ultimately shrink the number of people living with HIV/AIDS and the dimensions of this problem as a whole, we have to bring the new infections down even more. Only when that green line falls below the red line will the total number of people living with HIV/AIDS begin to decline, as shown by the blue line. And that's an important thing for several reasons. First of all, every person who is sustained on HIV/AIDS treatment costs between a few hundred and a few $1,000s per year, and most of that money is coming from public finances, some from donors and increasingly from the pockets of taxpayers in those countries. So that's one important reason. It just costs a lot of money. Another important reason is that these people are, almost all of them, the people in the poor countries or in the less developed countries, are dependent on donors for their daily livelihood, for that pill that keeps them alive one more day. So that creates a dependency link, and I want to suggest that that's a link that is not what we really want to achieve when we do foreign assistance. The idea of foreign assistance ultimately is to produce countries and populations that can develop on their own, not to increase their dependency on outside donors. So for those two reasons, and also because HIV infection is an unhealthy state, the objective ultimately should be to reduce the number of people living on HIV/AIDS. So this shows a model that you can download from the CGD website that I've written to help plan the fiscal future of a country according to different policies it might take towards AIDS treatment. And in this case, I'm doing this projection, I believe, for all of the sub-Saharan African continent. And what you see in these four panels are different aspects of the epidemic. So the upper left panel shows you the total numbers of people on antiretroviral treatment. And if you had a really effective prevention program, such as the one I'm simulating here, you might hope to reduce that number from its high of around 25 million people today to down to 20 million by the year 2050. And that's the number of people on antiretroviral treatment, actually. The total cost is going to go up to $20 billion if we want to achieve that. That's as opposed to $50 billion if we do a less effective job at HIV prevention. This dotted line here shows the total number of people living with HIV/AIDS after an AIDS transition that might occur in the year 2020. And that would, of course, reduce both the persons living with HIV/AIDS and also the number of annual deaths. The other thing that might happen if we actually were to effectively do this HIV prevention program is we would actually reduce over time the amount of money that is being spent on AIDS as a proportion of the global health of the health budgets in these countries. And that's important because unless these countries can ultimately take on this burden themselves, they will not get out from underneath this dependency. The good news here is that African countries are projected to grow very rapidly over this period. So if we do effective prevention, we not only reduce the numerator, which is the amount spent on AIDS, but we also grow the denominator, which is the total size of the economy. So we should be able to make this more sustainable. So the alternative way of looking at sort of what's being called a tipping point is being advanced by some people in the discussion, and that is to push the new infections below not the annual mortality from AIDS, but rather the annual number of people enrolling in treatment. Or, as it's usually expressed, let's increase the uptake on treatment so that the number of people being added to treatment each year exceeds the number of new infections. So that's, from a medical perspective alone, from a solely medical perspective, that seems like a really great idea because, after all, untreated people they're suffering health disadvantages, and we can help to prolong their lives if we can get them on treatment earlier. So the people who are advancing this have their eyes focused solely on that objective. So that's very admirable, and it will lead to reduction in mortality And to the extent that AIDS treatment also prevents people from infecting others, the goal of increasing treatment to exceed new infections will in fact slow new infections also. But there are these issues that we have to think about. First of all, the quality of care that's available currently today in most of Africa may not be sufficient to actually, keep people from infecting others by suppressing their viral load. And the problem also is that as you add more and more people to treatment, if this is your only policy approach towards the epidemic, the amount that you need to spend, that the government needs to spend and the donors need to spend, keeps growing without bound. And the dependency burden also grows. So really the AIDS transition, I think, is a preferable way to think about the policy objective because it unites into a single objective the two goals of suppressing mortality and ultimately shrinking the total number of people living with AIDS. And after all, it's when the total number of people living with AIDS is very small that the government will definitely be able to sustain their treatment. So how can we get to the AIDS transition? Well, in this book that Deepak told you about, I basically have two ideas which I want to share with you, and then we can open it up for questions. So the first idea has to do with the partnership arrangement between the donor, a donor like PEPFAR, and the recipient government. And the second idea has to do with focusing the donor's efforts, as well as the government's efforts, more on results and less on the inputs that we're spending so much money on now. Specifically, I'm suggesting that it might be possible to imagine paying a certain amount for every infection averted. So let's talk first about reframing the partnership. How many of you have actually been to a developing country? I've learned that you have this extraordinary opportunity here in ISU to actually visit developing countries as part of your what's it called, the Global Resources Program that you often get an opportunity to visit, and that's fantastic because what I want you to do is I want you to think of yourselves as the Minister of Finance in one of the countries that's receiving PEPFAR assistance today, and I want you to think about what this Minister of Finance is thinking when the ambassador to his country comes to him and asks him to take over paying for AIDS treatment. PEPFAR has been doing a lot of this. It's going to continue to do a lot of it. But increasingly, PEPFAR is asking for what they call a partnership. And what that partnership means effectively is that instead of paying a very tiny, sometimes a vanishingly small part of the cost of AIDS treatment, the Minister of Finance is being asked to take that on as part of his own budget. So the situation now, unfortunately, is that the Minister of Finance doesn't know whether a dollar that he commits to AIDS treatment would be offset by the donor removing a dollar. Okay? That's what I say by this top bullet on the left. The donor is actually free to move resources among recipient countries or withhold them altogether or change them to spend on maternal and child health instead of on AIDS treatment. So what I'm arguing for in my book is that actually the donors figure out a way to do something which unfortunately right now is illegal in the U.S., and that is to make an effective multi-year commitment to the country that they will not pull out money if the Minister of Finance puts some in. That would give the Minister of Finance some confidence that if he adds money to AIDS treatment, he'll be actually adding to the health benefits for his country instead of having his money simply offset. So the third bullet here is that if, in fact, as I suggest in the book, there is a agreement that the U.S. will fund a given percentage of the cost of the AIDS treatment in the country, and that's the commitment it makes over multiple years, That has an interesting incentive effect, too, on the Minister of Finance. It means that if the country is able to reduce its costs of delivering treatment, and Deepak and I were wondering whether this is really possible, but I think both of us have some hope that there could be improved efficiencies in AIDS treatment. If such efficiencies occur, the fact that the donor, say PEPFAR, has committed to funding, say, 50% of the AIDS treatment needs in the country means that the recipient, any money that it's spending, it will share in the savings. So the donor will get some of the savings of improved efficiency, but the recipient, the Minister of Finance, will get some of those savings as well. And furthermore, by committing to spending and supporting a given percentage of the need in a country, the donor achieves another improvement in the incentives, because it means that if HIV prevention effectively works in that country so that the need declines, it means that the recipient's share, whatever it's committing to spend, the other 50% or some percentage, that will become less expensive because it's X percent of a smaller need. So the donor would also benefit because it's say funding 50% of a smaller need. So by making a multi-year, so there are two aspects of this. The donor needs to make a multi-year commitment, and the commitment should be to a fixed percentage of the total need. With that combination offer, I'm suggesting that the incentives would change quite radically from what they are now. The Minister of Finance would have an incentive to not only spend money on AIDS treatment, but also to do more effective prevention to shrink the need. And the donor could go even further. The donor could say, if you manage to shrink the need faster than we currently project is really likely to happen, if we just follow the current trend, your need is going to change at a certain rate. If, in fact, you're able to really turn that down so that the total need declines over time, say over the next 5 to 10 years, that means because we've only committed to a percentage of need that we, the donor, are saving money. And what we will do in response to your effective reduction in the need is that we will increase our percentage. We will reward your effective prevention effort by allocating more money to your country from our overall global pot. So I think that with this kind of framing of the relationship between the donor and the recipient, the incentives would change, and the ministers of finance of the recipient countries would have more of a rationale for becoming engaged in funding the AIDS epidemic than they do have now. So that's sort of the first idea, to reframe that partnership. And I want to tell you that when I was in Harare, Zimbabwe last week, working with people from PEPFAR, one of the things that I was very intrigued by is that the South African government, as I understand it, has really been quite insistent in asking PEPFAR for a 5-year commitment on exactly what it was going to spend over the next 5 years. So I don't know that they read my book, but I think that South African government, first of all, they have a lot of bargaining power, more than, say, the government of Tanzania or some of the other smaller countries. And secondly, they wanted to assure themselves that now that they're dramatically increasing, and have already dramatically increased, but they're continuing to dramatically increase their funding for both treating and preventing AIDS, they wanted to know that there would not be a response from the U.S. government to pull out faster. They wanted to have that in place. Now, of course, the U.S. government isn't empowered legally to make a firm contract of that sort. The U.S. Congress only gives money for 1 year at a time, right? But the U.S. government, as I understand it, has made it an informal promise that its future spending path will be on a specific schedule, which it's provided in advance to the South African government. As far as I know, the U.S. government has not done that in any other recipient country, so the other ministers of finance are left wondering whether it's in their interests or in their country's interests to increase their financial commitment to the AIDS epidemic. So the other major idea I have here is really an application to the AIDS epidemic of an idea that we at the Center for Global Development believe in for a variety of reasons in all areas of foreign assistance. The idea itself is called cash on delivery. So cash on delivery is a phrase that used to be used by the U.S. Postal Service. Some of the older people here will remember it. The younger people have never heard COD. But it used to be something you could check when you rode away to Sears Roebuck and you ordered 2 pairs of dungarees to be delivered to your farm. You could check the box that said COD, and it meant that when the 2 pairs of dungarees arrived at your farm in Iowa, you would pay the postman on delivery. That's what cash on delivery means. So the cash on delivery idea in general, as we advocated at the Center for Global Development, is that in foreign assistance, we should clearly define the outcomes that we want to achieve. That is, we, the donors, would like to see achieved. And in the case of HIV, of course, there are both mortality reduction and HIV prevention outcomes. In my book, I advocate offering money specifically for HIV prevention. And I do that knowing that HIV prevention can be achieved with treatment as well as by direct behavioral prevention programs like condom distribution. So, for example, suppose you could offer $100 for every HIV infection prevented or averted. Why would that be an interesting idea, and how is it really different from the way donor assistance is done now for HIV/AIDS? So these ideas here are basically the principles on this slide. These are the principles of the way we think about cash on delivery aid, whether it be for education or improving water supply or for any particular program in a developing country. The idea is it rewards improvements in outcomes. A very important part of the idea is it keeps hands off, the donor keeps hands off of exactly how those achievements are obtained. So the donor does not get involved in delivering the services that might achieve the improvement in education or the reduction in HIV incidence. It's hands off in that sense. It's important to have independent verification of the measures of success because you don't want to incentivize a fraudulent statistics department inside the recipient country. You don't want to create incentives which would reward essentially deceptive measurement of HIV incidence. Everything has to be transparent, should be published in the press and so forth. And an important part of the transparency is that we hope that the programs that the donors would be incentivizing in this way would be programs that the local populations in those countries would also care about. So whether it's increasing school completion or reducing HIV incidence, the transparency means that the achievements that occur in that area would be publicly known in the newspapers and on the radio in the country to the local population so that they can come to appreciate the benefits of these government-sponsored programs, government and donor-sponsored programs. We think that the transparency is very important because it would improve the functioning of the democracy. It would connect the government to the people. And we're not arguing for cash on delivery to replace the existing methods of aid, which finance inputs, but rather to be a sort of a small bonus that's added to the existing programs. Now, those existing programs are not hands-off. So those things would continue, but we hope that by the addition of this bonus on top, which is itself hands-off, we would improve the motivation for all the actors to actually achieve the outcomes. So one of the reasons this has never been tried is actually HIV incidence is very, very hard to measure. HIV incidence is actually rare, despite the fact that there are 25 million people in Africa who are infected with HIV. The annual incidence rate in a given population is often 1% or less, even in heavily infected countries. It could be a lot higher than that. It can be as high as 7 or even 14% in very tiny very high-risk populations. But typically the incidence rate is less than 1%. And those of you who have done a little statistics know that if you want to accurately measure a change from 1% to 0.8%, which would be a superb achievement in the HIV/AIDS world, you need a very large sample. And so we need to think about how to actually estimate these incidence rates. In the book, we advocate two methods, one of which is ready today, but costs more money. And the other one we think will be ready tomorrow, and it's almost here. So the first approach is to simply measure the total number of infections, but do it much more frequently, and do it with larger samples so that you can measure the changes in number of people infected at a more local level, so that local populations can track the effectiveness of their local public health programs. So this is a graphic from our working paper that we did as background to thinking about this cash on delivery for HIV prevention idea. This is 4 separate sort of situations, 4 separate epidemic situations, if you will. This is an epidemic where the incidence is about 1% per year. 1 out of every 100 uninfected people becomes infected every year. This is an epidemic. These two are an epidemic that's twice as bad, with 2 out of 100 becoming infected every year. And we're imagining an intervention which is either able to reduce that infection rate by 20%, that would be from 1 to 0.8 or 2 to 1.6. So we'd reduce it by 20%, or we'd reduce it by 40%. The green line shows, the green space shows the combination that you would need of the years, the periodicity of the survey, how frequently you do it, and the sample size. So basically, the higher the periodicity, the more frequently you do the survey, and the higher the sample size, the more expensive it is. So we're talking millions of dollars as we get to high sample sizes and high frequency. And what you can see is that basically there's a lot more green down here. And what that tells you is that in an epidemic that's moving rapidly, where the incidence rate is high, it's easier to detect an improvement. So you don't need as large a sample size or as frequent a measurement. And that's also true if you have a very effective intervention. So you're able to actually achieve a 40% reduction. You don't need as large a sample size. So the idea is that we can make these calculations today about what sort of sample size and periodicity is needed in any given country, and we can actually measure the improvements, that is, the reductions in incidence that come from effective efforts in the recipient country. The other idea is a little bit science fiction, but here's a brand new, actually it's about a year-old report now from UNAIDS that suggests it's not totally science fiction. The idea is to use a special blood test which detects not only whether you're infected with HIV/AIDS, but how recently. And if we know within the population what number of people were infected within the last 6 months, for example, that's much better than just knowing how many total people are infected, because it tells us the incidence rate, the rate of new infections. And with a test like this, we would be able to use much smaller samples and have the same degree of accuracy in measuring incidence. So the idea and the hope for the cash-on-delivery approach to HIV prevention is that we could assure that HIV prevalence is measured without bias. We can do that if we have that third party conducting the survey. And we also need a fourth party to audit the survey. So we need to have real accuracy on this, and we need to have everybody be sure of it, both the recipient government that's going to receive the bonus payment and also the donor that's going to pay that payment have to be sure that the measurement is right. But we also have to prevent unintended consequences. We don't want the recipient government or some interest group within the recipient government to manipulate the situation in a way that's not consonant with the goals of HIV prevention and with ethical conduct. So that's why we have what the World Bank calls a social audit. We have NGOs be engaged with, for example, high-risk populations to make sure that the ways in which incidence is reduced meet international norms with respect to ethics. So if this idea works, this cash-on delivery for HIV prevention, it's going to elicit, because it's hands-off and it rewards the result rather than just paying for, condoms, we believe will elicit the local use of the best HIV prevention ideas. So if the best ideas have to do with forming, anti-AIDS clubs, they'll do that. If the best idea is to have a medical intervention like male circumcision or extremely effective treatment that suppresses the viral load so that people are non-infectious, that's what they'll do. They'll do whatever it takes locally to reduce the HIV incidence. And because the HIV incidence is going down, that means that the total number of people living with HIV/AIDS are going down. That means the number of people whose treatment has to be financed goes down, and that makes treatment sustainable. It puts universal access to treatment within reach, and if it's really working properly, and that social audit is having the important effect that it needs to have, it'll do all of this without unintended consequences, and therefore lead us to an AIDS transition. So I'll stop there, and I hope you all have some questions.
With the cash on delivery idea, I'm wondering if, and I sort of had the same sort of thought as you were going through, for example, the South Africa case, and you're thinking of finance ministers who are worried that if AIDS prevention is too effective, that it may actually cost their level of aid. Is there evidence that, in fact, there are countries that have, in essence, held back on AIDS prevention or AIDS treatment in part because they wanted to increase the amount of aid that they're getting from international agencies?
So there's no evidence of that. In particular, I don't believe there's any evidence with respect to HIV prevention that any country has refrained from HIV prevention in the pursuit of aid dollars. The issue on treatment is sort of where are the ministers of finance today? And where they are today is with a situation where in the typical low-income country, the proportion of AIDS spending, which is supported by outside donors, can be as high as 80 or 90%. And that's much higher than is true for other areas of even the health budget. So given that situation, if they take money away from some other part of their budget and put it into AIDS treatment, what can they expect the donor to do? If the donor provides at least, as PEPFAR is now in South Africa, a specific amount that it's going to be spending each subsequent year. Or what I recommend is that the donor commit to a specific percentage of need in each subsequent year. In either of those situations, the donor's locked in. And I believe that's good for the developing country. Once the donor's locked in, the developing country can make its decisions, and it knows that if it adds resources, it will benefit from those resources.
I kind of had a couple questions, and the first one was just how COD works, I guess, specifically. Is that funding then earmarked for health prevention or HIV treatment, or what is that money earmarked for? And then can you talk a little bit about just the issues around testing itself? I mean, a huge hindrance in that is the stigma behind HIV and people not wanting to get tested? Just
So
how-
on the first point, imagine when you were back living at home and your mom says, or your dad, you know what, we're going to pay you $25 to cut the grass. Or maybe only $5. I don't know. What do kids get these days? So imagine two possibilities. One is we're going to give you this $20 to cut the grass, and you can spend it on anything you want. And the other possibility is we'll give you the $20, but you have to buy this shirt we've already picked out for you. Okay, so which works better as an incentive? The same logic, I would argue, works for the cash on delivery example. If we want this money to be as incentivizing as possible, then no, we do not require it be spent even on AIDS, even on health. The government is free to use it any way it wants. Now, my own story that I tell in here is based on something I observed with respect to malaria in the Solomon Islands. In the Solomon Islands, there was a ship that visited one of the islands in the archipelago with tourists, and it was an immense source of income. It would come twice a year. And one year, there was a malaria case among the tourists from the ship. So the line called up the mayor of the little island and said, "I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to come back anymore because one of our tourists got sick, and we simply can't take the risk of bringing our cruise ship into dock so the tourists can shop on your island next year." So the mayor was very concerned about that because this is the principal source of the island's revenue and income. So he went to the WHO malaria control experts on the other island, the capital island, which is called Honore, and he said, "Can you help me? What can I do to stop malaria?" And they say, "Well, we've been telling you. Every year we come and do those education programs about malaria. You know what to do." And the guy said, yeah, but we weren't paying attention. Okay? So now, really, you come tell us. And the story is a fantastic success story because the islanders got together. They said, okay, this is really serious. We really have to stop this epidemic of malaria here cold. And so they did the larviciding, they did the bed nets, they did the indoor residual spraying, they did all those things with much more adherence, punctuality, they applied themselves, and the community itself, if one person was a slacker and didn't get rid of the standing water in their spare tires in the backyard, the rest of the community would get on them. So the whole community banded together, and what we saw was actually malaria eradication, so the tour ship was able to return. So I use that as an example of how an incentive could work. And what I'm imagining for this, imagine you're trying to run for mayor in the small town where I was a Peace Corps volunteer, for example, in Tenkodogo, Burkina Faso. You're running for mayor. Can you talk about HIV? What are people going to think if you start talking about, sexual partnerships and condoms? You're running for mayor. They're going to say, get a life. You're a weirdo. But suppose you could say, because the country as a whole struck a COD agreement, would say, I don't know, what's the biggest foundation in Iowa? You don't have Bill Gates here. Maybe you have somebody else. So suppose that there's an agreement between that foundation and Burkina Faso, and then the Minister of Finance and Health say, now how are we going to use this bonus money? I know what we could do. We can give a soccer field to the district which achieves the biggest reduction in HIV incidence. So maybe that changes the sort of dialogue. Maybe the mayor can suddenly talk about HIV, right? Because he can talk about football, he probably does already. And if he could bring if he could say, look, guys, this is an opportunity that we have as a group, so what can we do? And start a conversation going, I think it changes the whole nature of the intervention. So that's my first thing. No, the money should not be pre-designated by the donor. On the stigmatizing thing, the issue of stigma is very important, but HIV testing is not the key aspect of HIV prevention. HIV testing is absolutely necessary to get people onto treatment, but there isn't much evidence to show that testing per se actually reduces risky behavior. The things that do reduce risky behavior are still pretty mysterious. We don't entirely understand them. But testing doesn't seem to, by itself, work.
And we will have one more question.
So it sounds like these ideas will benefit all parties involved. So what's it going to take to get them implemented, and when can we expect to see that?
So the cash on delivery idea meets a lot of resistance within the foreign assistance community for a variety of reasons. And some of them, I think, don't make much sense to those of us who aren't bureaucrats. For example, one fear that many bureaucrats express is that if the portion of their budget depends on the results that are achieved in the field, they won't be able to predict how much they're going to be able to spend next year because they don't know in advance the results. And bureaucrats hate that, right? They want to be able to spend every last penny in their budget so they can argue for more. The last thing they want is to have to give money back because, the results weren't quite achieved. So any uncertainty in the they try to eliminate that, and they resist the COD idea for that reason. They also resist it because often they think they really do know better than the people on the ground how to achieve the health benefits or the education benefits. And that belief is supported by a whole community of Beltway bandits around Washington who are in the business of being experts in HIV prevention, AIDS treatment, education, all of the aspects of foreign assistance. So that entire interest group feels cut out. When Nancy Birdsall first presented this idea in her book that I cited in my slide, a young woman who works for one of the NGOs stood up and said, if you do COD, now she's thinking of a situation where COD would totally replace traditional aid, which we don't think should happen right away. But if you were to only do COD, if all foreign assistance were cash on delivery, what would we do? Right? So Nancy's response to that was, you would be called upon by the recipient government if they think they need you. So obviously, this is not a very popular way to go with a lot of those people who want desperately to be involved there and are not sure they would be if it was the government of Burkina Faso that was making the budget choices.
All right, that was our last question. If you have any other further questions, you can join Dr. Over in the back, but please join me in thanking him and the economics department that's brought him.
Thanks very much. Well,